to welcome you to today's event. And I've got a couple quick announcements first. We have 3 energy events in November. We hope you'll be able to join us. The first is on November 9th. We have a PURPA at 40, Renewable Energy Law and Policy in the United States Conference. It's an all-day conference. Registration is required. There are details, speaker list, agenda, all of that on our website. On November 14th, we'll be joined by our 14th annual Young Scholar lecturer, who this year is Uka, who is a professor of law at the University of Kansas School of Law, and she'll be delivering a talk on state energy law for a modern low-carbon grid. And then on November 29th, we'll be joined by Joseph Kiesecker, the lead scientist for the Nature Conservancy's Conservation Lands team, and he'll be delivering a presentation based on his new book, Energy Sprawl Solutions, Balancing Global Development and Conservation. So a lot of energy talks in November, more details online. Please plan to join us. And a couple quick announcements for today. There's a sign-up sheet that's being passed around. Please sign it. It enables us to track attendance and also to notify you of future events. And then you may have noticed when you came in that the King's English Bookshop has joined us today. And after her presentation, Heather Hansen will be happy to sign books. So please drop by the King's English book table. And then finally, and most importantly, I would like to thank the Cultural Vision Fund, which has provided funding for this lecture, as well as other Stegner Center lectures, our Young Scholar program, and our annual symposium. We're deeply indebted to the Cultural Vision Fund for their support of our center and our various programs. We wouldn't be able to do it without them. Today's Stegner lecture is Wildfire on the Front Lines with Station 8, and our presenter is Heather Hansen. Heather Hansen is an award-winning reporter specializing in science and narrative journalism. While researching wildfire on the front lines with Station 8, she became a certified wildland firefighter. Despite being a seasoned mountaineer and 3-time marathoner, the PAC test, which includes covering 3 miles in 45 minutes wearing a 45-pound weight vest, was one of her most grueling physical challenges. Her work has appeared in newspapers and magazines from San Francisco to Johannesburg, including High Country News, Men's Journal, National Geographic Traveler, Sunday Independent, Smithsonian, and Outside magazine. She is the co-author of the award-winning Disappearing Destinations, 37 Places in Peril and What Can Be Done to Help Save Them. Her book, Prophets and Moguls, Rangers and Rogues, Bison and Bears, 100 Years of the National Park Service, won the Colorado Authors League General Nonfiction Award and was a finalist for the Colorado Book Award. She currently lives in Boulder. Please join me in welcoming Heather Hansen.
Hi, everybody. How are you? Is that volume level pretty good? Yeah. All right. Thank you for that warm welcome. And thank you for coming. I don't know if it's true here, but in Colorado, where I'm from, as soon as it starts to cool down a little bit, it's like fire doesn't exist. We stop talking about it, but we need to talk about it year-round, so I'm very thankful that you're here to do that. This is one book, but it really tells 2 stories. The first is the story of fire in this country, where we've been, where we are now, and where we're likely headed. And the second, which is kind of folded into the first, is a narrative about firefighters in this country with boots on the ground. Today I want to give you kind of a crash course on how fires have been changing over the last few decades and what that means for all of us who live and work in and play in Western landscapes in particular. And I just wanted to start by saying a little bit about how this book came about. In the mainstream media, I think you and I tend to see the same thing year after year. We see the same characters, firefighters in the fray, victims maybe whose houses have burned down, maybe a culprit whose escaped campfire caused all that chaos. And I'm sure you've seen some of the popular images of firefighters with soot-streaked faces, maybe towns in ruins, huge air tankers with that veil of red retardant trailing them. And those are all real things, those are all serious things, but they're really only part of the story. And I really wanted to offer a more complete picture than what we generally see. And that's what I hope that I was able to do in the book. And it's an important moment to do that because over the past several years, fires have been getting bigger, they've been getting deadlier, and more expensive and more destructive. So to do that, I spent nearly 2 years shadowing an elite firefighting crew through nearly everything they did. Training, working out, prescribed burns, PR, actual wildland fires, and many, many marathon eating sessions. There's so much food involved. Over time, I think, became one of the guys, at least that's how the chief and the Boulder crew described it. I was hanging around so much, they were just changing out of their uniforms at the end of the day with me there, just dropping their pants while I'm scribbling away everything that they're saying. But that's Boulder here. Maybe some of you know it. During that time, I didn't just learn about putting out fires. The crew really taught me a different way of looking at the landscape, of a different way of feeling atmospheric conditions. And during my time with them, I actually learned a new language. Fire, some of you may know, it has its own vernacular. Some of the terms: backfire, flaming front, hotspot, slop over, spot fire. Some of those terms I learned during that time. And during that time, I also realized that firefighting really has its own unique calling and demands. So that same summer that I started hanging out with the crew, I also went out to western Colorado to become a certified wildland firefighter, as Jan mentioned. I wanted to see what kind of training was involved and what fitness was necessary to do the job, really what a rookie wildland firefighter was getting into the front lines with. This is me and my fellow trainees and instructors at fire camp. And although it has the word camp in the title, I assure you we had no s'mores, sadly, although the food was quite abundant. And this time at fire camp consisted of a couple of things. First, training, learning the basics of fire, or the components of a fire triangle. What's a burning index? What's an energy release component? And we spent some time analyzing, importantly, what went wrong on fatality fires. We also had a wildland fire simulation where our instructors actually set a fire in the shadow of Mount Shavano, which you can see in the bottom left of those slides. And that was telling. It was very intense to hustle to a fire and swing heavy tools while choking on smoke. Later I learned that the fire had spread a little bit faster than our instructors had intended. So we got at least a brief sense of fire's raw power that day. I also, as Jan said, took what's called the work capacity test, or the PAC test, and that's, again, covering 3 miles in 45 minutes with a 45-pound weight vest. And you're not allowed to run, you have to walk, which is much harder than it sounds like. And I'm not particularly wimpy, maybe you got a sense from what Jan said, but nevertheless, it was one of the toughest physical things that I ever had to do. One of the things I noticed first is that everything is so heavy in firefighting, the equipment, from your hard hat to the tools, chainsaws, even that scratchy Nomex gear that you see, the yellow shirt and the green pants and the heavy boots. And you're doing all of that, plus smoke, unpredictability, different hazards. And I learned, and I talk about this a lot in the book, from an exercise physiologist in Montana, that firefighters are elite athletes. They're actually among the top 5% of most fit people in the world. And I saw that in their workouts several times, which I took part in. This photo was taken during a training hike with the Boulder crew in the foothills outside Boulder. I did what I could to keep up with them, then they got to the top of the hill and did pull-ups on branches with their 50-pound packs on. So all that working out requires a lot of eating, and most often in my experience that meant bacon. I'm not sure what it is, but a phrase I heard many times was, when fires burn, pigs die. I think bacon is like an essential food group. But when they're actively engaging a blaze, a wildland firefighter can consume 7,000 calories a day. And those physical demands of facing fires from the Alaskan tundra to the Everglades in Florida are many. There's temperature extremes, there's altitude to consider, remoteness, and there are a lot of other hazards other than the fire itself. Think poison ivy, snakes, grizzly bears. One guy on the Boulder crew was actually stunned by a scorpion while he was taking a nap on a fire in California. All right, yuck. So physical stamina, I learned, is key. But mental fortitude is also critical. Sometimes that means enduring a 16-hour shift of digging a fire line, which may sound boring, but you have to do that the whole time while your head's up on a fire. You have to know where it is and where you are relative to that fire. And often that's with minimal sleep. We heard a lot about that in the news this year, particularly in California. So it's dirty, it's exhausting. The strain can be great on minds, on bodies, on relationships. So we wonder why they do it. And that's one of the important questions I look at in the book. And this is really important to understand in order to grasp how fires are fought today. In my experience, many firefighters, they simply seem programmed to help. Many certainly want to protect natural resources and to educate other people about that. Some just want an office with no ceiling. And they get to experience a lot in the outdoors that you and I probably never will. They can be out in Glacier National Park when it's absolutely closed to other people hiking around, and it can be beautiful. The chief of the crew in Boulder told me recently about a fire in Wyoming where he was kept awake all night by the baying of wolves. But I think the most compelling reason that I heard time and again throughout my time reporting was that there's an indisputable camaraderie among them, akin probably to a military battalion. They're a family, and they're a family that goes up against a force that can have a more transformative effect on the environment than other natural events like floods or earthquakes, even volcanic eruptions. So this brings me quickly to the story of Wildfire itself, which is, I think, helpful to encapsulate here. Fire, of course, is not new on the landscape. Both natural and human-caused fires have been around for millennia and more. Native Americans used fire for a lot of reasons, and later white settlers did as well. There are lots of observations of fires if you look at the journals of Lewis and Clark in the early 19th century, and many others. Even Mark Twain wrote about fire. He has a funny and somewhat harrowing story about camping near Lake Tahoe in 1872 when his dinner campfire escaped and went big. Does anybody remember John Wesley Powell? Probably at the Stegner Center you do. He was the one-armed explorer, first navigated the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River. He was on a geological survey in 1879 of the Rocky Mountains when he wrote, "In general, it may be stated that the timber regions are fully adequate for which the industrial interests of the country will require if they can be protected from desolation by fire." That's a lot of words. I don't know if he was getting paid by the word, but basically what he was trying to say was there's plenty of wood if we could just keep it from burning. So by Powell's time, that's almost 140 years ago now, the perception of fire was already taking a turn from an ally, something that helped people excel on the landscape, to something undesirable at best, a resource killer. And going forward, that rhetoric really intensified. Fire was called, quote, a great enemy of the forest. They knew that fire was necessary. I don't want to get that wrong. They knew that, or have you get that wrong? They knew that it shaped forests, but that's exactly what they didn't want it to do. So not long after the turn of the century, the U.S. Forest Service came along in 1905, as you probably know, and its first head was a guy named Gifford Pinchot, and he really grasped the critical role of fire in the ecology of healthy forests. At the same time, you may also know he was a consummate utilitarian. He felt that forests had to be protected because of what they provided. Clean water for drinking and irrigating, grass for grazing, and of course timber for building. He wrote, quote, "The best way for the government to promote each of these three great uses is to protect the forest reserves from fire." And so that's exactly what they set about doing. Modestly, at first. This is an early bucket brigade, not much maybe compared to our helicopters with Bambi buckets or tankers dropping slurry today, but I'm sure they did their best. Here's another early firefighting technique. I'm not sure what this guy is using to try to put out the fire. His jacket maybe, or a burlap sack, somebody has suggested to me before. In any case, a tiring tactic and ultimately not very effective. So it wasn't long, just a handful of years after the Forest Service was formed, that these modest early firefighting techniques were really put to the test. So in the spring and early summer of 1910, the snowpack had been abysmal and no rain had fallen for months. Passing storms showered the area only with dry lightning. A forest ranger in Montana, writing at the time, described those days as oppressive and explosive. That August in 1910, powerful Chinook, or the so-called snow eater winds, they fanned 1,000 small fires across Montana, Idaho, and Washington. And those flames advanced upwards, in some cases, of 70 miles per hour across the landscape. They overtook broad rivers, and they hurled century-old trees like tumbleweed. Some of you have probably heard of the Big Burn of 1910, as it came to be called. A lot of fire survival stories emerged from this time, including the one of Ed Pulaski and his crew. Pulaski and his crew had been out when the fire quickly closed in behind them. The wind was so strong that they were thrown from their saddles, and they ultimately took off running towards an abandoned mine that Pulaski knew about. You can see the mine opening there, and that's Pulaski standing on the trunk of a tree. At one point, writing afterwards, Pulaski said that in the chaos, he noticed as he and his crew were running that a bear had joined them and was running alongside them. I don't know what happened when they got to the opening of the tunnel, but they made it to the tunnel ultimately. They hung wet blankets over the opening, and they pressed their faces down into the dirt in an attempt to stay below those toxic gases. Pulaski threatened to shoot anyone who threatened to leave the tunnel, and I just wanted to read you a bit from the book. Pulaski awoke the next morning as one of his men was informing the others that the boss was dead. Like hell he is, said Pulaski, crawling out of the mine. 5 men had perished, but dozens had survived. Their clothes were shredded, and their shoes had been burned off their feet. Pulaski had been burned and temporarily blinded. When they reached the nearby creek, the men were dismayed to find, though the water was running, it was too warm and ash-filled to drink. Making their way back toward Wallace, 10 miles away, the party met a group of women from town who offered them hot coffee, whiskey, and cold water. They partook solely of the water. It's probably the first time they turned down free whiskey, but... So when that terrible August day finally came to a close, fire had swept across 3 million acres and had killed at least 85 people, including 78 firefighters. This is what was left of the town of Wallace, Idaho. It's kind of amazing when you see that not more people weren't killed. They were apparently jumping on moving trains as the trains were going through town just to get out of there. So, of course, there had been big fires before the big blow-up of 1910, but that one really got everyone's attention. Here's some headlines from the time. And that included, it got the attention of people, including Congress, and they backed the Forest Service, still fledgling at that time, with new legislation and money. From that point on, the Forest Service efforts focused on 3 things: prevention, detection, and suppression of fires. Eventually, that meant putting out every fire as quickly as possible. That so-called 10 a.m. policy, maybe you've heard of if you know anything about fire, it was adopted a little bit less than a century ago, and it said that every fire should be put out by the morning after it was reported. So with all that new money, firefighters were getting better equipped. This photo always kind of makes me laugh because it looks like a band on an album cover, showing off their new gear. I'm sure they were very proud of it. So during this time, some tremendous scientific innovation is going on, and a lot of sweat being expended into pursuing that 3-prong objective, predicting, spotting, and putting out fires as quickly as possible. Here's one example of that ingenuity. At the time, you can read read a lot more about fire science in the book. I spent a lot of fascinating hours at the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab in Montana. Also during this time, there are aggressive campaigns to recruit the public into the fight against wildfire. You can see here, Fire Wrecks a Forest, and that's Roosevelt on the bottom there with the poster that says, "Your forests, your fault." And who here did not learn as a kid that only you can prevent forest fires? So these efforts, both the money the Forest Service was putting into equipment and science and public campaigns, they really began to pay off, at least in terms of limiting fire, at least in terms of that objective. So what did that look like on the landscape? Well, into the 1940s, 30, 40, 50 million acres were burning every year. By the 1950s, that number of acreage began to decline, and it dropped steadily into the 1980s, finally bottoming out in 1984, I think down to 1.4 million acres per year. So by this point in time, it was taking about a decade to burn what used to burn in 1 year. And over time, what that meant is that we got to the point where we are now, where 97% approximately of fires that start in this country are put out. By the way, this is the real Smokey Bear, rescued from a wildfire in New Mexico in 1950. Apparently soon after that was shipped to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., which was the most popular exhibit I think they ever had in the zoo's history. So 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, most people thought that fire should be prevented and extinguished at all costs. Over the 1960s and 70s, that perception started to change, to shift somewhat to a greater understanding the importance of fire in the ecology of healthy forests. Some people talked about how putting out fires was not good for the landscape and ultimately endangered people. And land managers were starting to introduce or reintroduce more fire into the landscape. Minds were changing at that point. That is until the summer of 1988. So in modern history, one really important moment in society's relationship with wildfire came in Yellowstone in 1988. This is what it looked like when the fires there were happening. There's actually several fires, kind of like the 1910 burn, that sprang up and merged together. One law enforcement ranger there said it sounded like 10 freight trains bearing down on him. That's what it looked like in Yellowstone in '88. So those fires at that time made national news. Tom Brokaw, a popular news anchor at the time, reported that our oldest national park was, quote, under siege. It was a media frenzy. Here's a media crew. I'm not sure what they're trying to get footage of here, maybe just smoke. But that's all you could see that summer. So people all over the country were kind of freaking out. They were calling their representatives, criticizing the Park Service for, quote, letting it burn. That's when this term actually kind of came into popular being. But it had been the Park Service's policy since 1972 to let naturally caused fires burn where it was safe to do that, of course. And that seemed to work out fine until the fires in Yellowstone that summer. They were exhibiting some odd behavior. They were moving faster and further than their models from the fire lab were predicting, causing spot fires with such persistence that firefighters couldn't safely get at it. So the nation was seeing images of Old Faithful Lodge here with 100-foot tall lodgepole pines just being plowed down by wind and fire. Yellowstone was ultimately declared a federal disaster area. The superintendent at the time was a guy named Bob Barbie, and people called him Bob Barbecue, Barbecue Bob. Anyway, in the end, over 1 million acres had burned that summer, including over 1/3 of the park. And the fires were unprecedented, at least in that it had been the driest summer in the park's history combined with some pretty intense winds, which just tore through decades of unburned vegetation. At first it looked like a moonscape. I hope this guy already had lunch by the time he got here. Not much to snack on. So many fretted that Yellowstone had been destroyed, was a word that a lot of people used, that it was gone forever. But the fire hadn't destroyed it, really kind of acted as a catalyst for transformation. And I'll show you what I mean. This is what the area looked like 1 week after the fire went through. This is a month later. This is a year later. This is 10 years later. Maybe you can see where I'm going with this. So here's a look at it now. Just quickly, there's a story behind this sign. Some forester was visiting from another part of the world, and it was maybe 10 to 15 years after the fire, and he asked the Park Service how they had gone about replanting all of these trees. They seemed so evenly spaced and so abundant. And the Forest Service said, well, we didn't. We just did it themselves. The thought of one person had that question, maybe other people did, so that's the Park Service for you. Now there's a sign. So nobody had seen it in Yellowstone in modern history, but a fire like that was really normal in many ways for that area. Lodgepole pines, which make up about 80% of the forests in Yellowstone, they actually rely on fire. They have certain cones that stay on their branches until the resin gets hot enough to melt and disperse the seeds. And lots of seeds are dispersed. They counted them in Yellowstone. Per acre, upwards of 2 million seeds were dispersed. Now, I love the outdoors, but can you imagine that being your job, counting the seeds dispersed in 1 acre of Yellowstone? Okay. So while what happened in Yellowstone was not destructive from an ecological perspective, the fire did cause damage of another kind. Whatever ecological understanding that I alluded to before that had kind of been gained in the 60s and 70s about the importance of fire to healthy ecosystems, that momentum really had been lost. 1990 fire policy may as well have been 1890 fire policy. So this past August, it was 30 years since the Yellowstone fires. You might think that this photo was taken back then, when there was so much backlash about the fire. I don't know if you can read it there, but oh yeah, it's pretty big in here. MPS sucks, S-U-X. Smokey says, put out the fires, right? But the photo wasn't taken in the 80s, it was taken in 2016. And that's when about 60,000 acres burned in the park. That's the most area that had burned there since the fires of 1988. So this is a pretty clear indication that, at least in some places, even now, people really disagree with the way the Park Service handles fire, which in this case, again, was to let it burn. It was history repeating itself in some ways. So why, 30 years later, are we so resistant to fire? And this is one question that I take on with the help of a lot of experts in the book. In one word, fear. The 80s and 90s passed after Yellowstone, with one huge blaze after another, particularly in the western U.S., and we arrived at the turn of the century, and the term megafire was coined, and that was coined to mean what it does now, that fires over 100,000 acres. So Utah's largest fire in recorded history burned 363,000 acres in 2007. Maybe some of you were here for that. You can see it here. It's the Milford Flat Fire, or at least that's what it looked like after it had already burned about 320,000 acres, I think. I have to admit I kind of geek out on these satellite images, but the reason that I wanted you to see it is to get a sense of the enormity of the area that we're talking about when we use the word megafire. So that area burned that you can see in dark brown, it really dwarfs the rivers, the farms, the cities, the mountains even in that frame. And here's a look at, I think this NASA image was just captured a couple of weeks ago. This is the Pole Creek fire and the Bald Mountain fire. The Pole Creek, I think, was about 102,000 acres when this satellite image was snapped, and the Bald Mountain was about 18,000 acres or so. So can you imagine being a 5 or 6 foot tall human and trying to do anything about that? Yet that's what wildland firefighters sign up to do every year. And they're doing that in an increasingly dangerous environment. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So a couple of other important things have happened between the Yellowstone fires and now that have made wildfires worse and have encouraged our resistance to fire. First, over the past few decades, housing has expanded into areas where fire had once been a frequent visitor. During this time, private land in what's now called the wildland-urban interface, as you can see there, it began to change. Many more people were moving into areas, building on land adjacent to national forests and the like. So millions of people now live in the interface, in close proximity to wildlands. In Utah, I think about 14% of homes are categorized in high or extreme danger or risk from wildfire, and that's about 133,000 homes. So that means this influx of people into what's called the WUI, the wildland-urban interface, it means that we now have a lot of values at risk. We have homes, we have ecosystems, we have watersheds, we have recreation areas, we have air quality, and most importantly, lives. Wildland firefighters now deal with structures on almost every fire that they fight. That was not true in the past. And the danger and complexity for wildland firefighters is increased because of that. We've seen this many times, and I tell some truly hair-raising stories in the book. So during this time, as the look of a lot of private land was changing, the composition of many public lands was also changing for the reasons that I've already mentioned. Active fire suppression throughout the time from the time the Forest Service. I do that, I say fire service instead of Forest Service. That's kind of the colloquial name, the U.S. Fire Service, because they fight so many fires. But during that time, those vast, open, park-like forests that Lewis and Clark talked about, they were getting choked with vegetation. And that's not true everywhere. I think it's a popular misconception, but it's true certainly in low elevation forests. And in a spot like this is Glacier National Park. That top image is from 1937. Bottom image is from 2008. So a major change in the forest density in that 70 or so years. So we let many forest areas grow out of control, and then we stuck a bunch of houses nearby. And it wasn't long before we started seeing the consequences of that. When fire did finally return to areas where it had been excluded, it in many cases became unstoppable. And I want to give you a brief, better sense of really what's been going on. I promise I only have 2 graphs. And I'll just do them one after the other, like ripping off a Band-Aid. But I told you earlier that the number of acres burned per year declined, as you can see from the left hand, down to the middle, finally bottoming out in the 1980s. From anywhere from 30 to 50 million acres down to just over 1 million acres per year. And with the aggressive fire detection and suppression, that bottomed out, but then in the 80s, something odd started to happen. As you can see in the graph, the average number of acres per year started to climb again, from roughly 2 million acres or so burned per year to about 6 million acres or so. And I should say anomalous years, 2015, 2017, over 10 million acres burned. So far this year, I think we're at 7.7 million acres. Here's a closer look at the past 60 years or so. And when you look at the numbers, you can also see something else really interesting. While the average acreage burned began to climb, the average number of fires began to go down. So we can see clearly that there are fewer fires, but the fires that we do have are much bigger. than they used to be. Most Western states have experienced their worst wildfires in the past 10 to 15 years. So that so-called phenomenon of the megafire was basically unheard of before 1995. But just since 2005 or so, there have been roughly 10 megafires per year. And that's really beginning to transform the landscape of the American West. So at this moment in time, we have the number of fires going down, but the number of acreage spiking enormously. And I wondered, and I ask in the book, again, with the help of lots of experts, answer this question. Why, with all the advances in firefighting forces, tactics, equipment, with all the new scientific understanding that we have of fire, why are we now losing ground again? What or who is to blame for that? Is it simply too many houses, too many people, too many trees? Why is it that we're returning to a regime of larger fires when we're still actively extinguishing about 97% of them? I spent a lot of time on this book, but in the book on it, but I just want to give you the broad strokes here. Over the past few years, a strong link has been made between wildfires and climate change. One recent study, actually out of Boulder, concluded that human-caused warming, especially, doubled the total area burned in the western U.S. over the past 30 years. Human-caused warming doubled the average acreage in the western U.S. over the past 30 years. And that's because fire conditions are changing. The landscape is changing. In general, temperatures are going down, or temperatures are going up. Moisture levels are going down. And what that means is that snowpack melts earlier, spring is coming prematurely, and dry time for forests is lengthened. All of these things begin to add up. And this has had an extended and intensifying effect on the wildland fire season. Now, in the U.S., the fire season is about 78 days longer than it was in 1979. Ultimately, we are moving toward, in a lot of places, a year-round fire season. By the way, this is a very thirsty, low-elevation forest in Sequoia National Park. So climate change isn't just changing the length of the fire season, but the substance of it. We're seeing more fires exhibiting extreme behavior than ever before. Rapid fire, spread, intense burning, that kind of thing. In short, causing fires that are harder to put out. So what does climate change mean for our future with fire? As you might expect, climatologists predict a future with even larger blazes. So what do we do about that? Well, in one conversation that I had with a preeminent fire scientist in Missoula, he said that he asked people all the time, what kind of relationship do you want to have with fire? And they say, well, I would rather it not come here. We'd like to prevent it at all costs. And he says, well, there's not really a card in the deck for that. Eventually, it will come to you. So what kind of relationship do we want to have with fire? Well, we'd rather it not burn down our homes, or our playgrounds, or our watersheds. Certainly, we don't want it to kill anybody. So how do we prevent that? Well, I learned in my firefighter training that there are three things that affect a fire: weather, topography, and fuels. So what's going on in the atmosphere? Where is the fire burning, on flat ground or on a slope? And what's burning? Is it houses? Is it small diameter trees? Is it grasses? And what of those three things, weather, topography, and fuels, can we do anything about? Just only the fuels, right? So if we want to change this trajectory, we really have to step up our game in terms of that one factor: taking responsibility for our land. And that's both public and private spaces. First, we have to be sensible about development. As you may have noticed on that map of the wildland interface that I showed you earlier, by some estimates, only 20% of the West is built out. So that leaves a lot of private land still up for grabs. Maybe not in Utah, where I think roughly 2/3 of the state is public land. But still, there's a lot that can be done with existing structures and with the help of the world expert in that area. I talk about how to do that in the book. Ultimately, it's not a firefighter's job to save a house. They're not supposed to be anywhere near it, in fact, if it's too dangerous to do that. But what is too dangerous for these people who are programmed to help? It's a question that I look at in the book, in particular in relation to this fire that you see in this slide, which was the Cold Springs fire above Boulder in 2016. During that fire, the incident commander said to me, "We walk the line as close to stupid as we can," right? So not always a clear-cut situation. So that's private land. How do we take responsibility for public land, which again, particularly important here in Utah? In general, we need to do a better job of mimicking the natural process, creating a historic patchwork of forests that had different types, different sizes, and different densities of trees. Diversity on the landscape is something that tempers fire severity. It makes forests more resilient, makes us more resilient. And in short, we do that with fuel treatments. And I'm going to kind of speed through this. You can read a lot more about it in the book. But fuel treatments really mean two things. Forest restoration is sometimes culling, but also using prescribed burns. In short, we really need more of the right types of fire. We don't need more of the type of fire that we've seen, particularly in California this year, or even here, that burns down people's houses, but we need more of the right type of fire in the right places. But burning of any kind is not a well-supported practice in the West. I saw this even in Boulder, which people I think consider in kind of an enlightened place in terms of understanding the science behind having to do it. It was, you're ruining my workout on a day that a prescribed burn is, or the smoke is getting in my drapes, that kind of thing. And people are afraid of air quality. They're afraid of something going wrong. And those are all real and serious things and possibilities. But I can assure you, when a fire goes big, like they do nowadays, the air quality is much worse, and they are much more unpredictable. So what I've touched on today is just a fraction of what I learned hanging out with scientists, foresters, of course, firefighters. You can read much more in the book, especially considering policy, if you're particularly interested in that. I get into that from the local to the national level. Ultimately, I think moving toward a mindset that tolerates fire is one that balances the needs of humans and the ecosystem. Easier said than done, for sure. But the bottom line is we need to change the way we think about fire, the way that we live with fire. And we need to do it now because I think, as we can see, year after year, the stakes are just too high not to. And I just want to leave you with a parting thought from the Boulder crew. Brian Oliver, you can see second to last in that photo. We were hiking in the foothills of Boulder fairly recently, and he looked around and he said, "Well, this is paradise, isn't it? It's Boulder, it's Bend, it's Bozeman, and Salt Lake City. We all want to live in paradise, right? But if we do, we're going to have to work for it." So thank you so much for listening. Hopefully you have questions. Tough questions are my favorite. I like to work the brain. Yeah?
Has anyone quantified the mega fire initiation causes, natural versus man?
In terms of, I think there's a microphone somewhere, but just to repeat the question for you, because I know they're recording this, has anyone quantified the causes of mega fires, natural caused versus man-made? Yes, there's a wealth of information on the National Interagency Fire Center website, and you can look from year to year the number and proportion of acreage burned, lightning caused, for example, versus human caused. And generally, human caused fires are way more abundant, but they burn much less acreage, and that's simply because fires generally start near where people generally cause fires that start near where people live, so they get pounced on very quickly, versus a lightning caused blaze in a wilderness area in Alaska or something, and they will let it burn. So you can see years like 2015, where out of those 10 million acres, I think 5 million burned in Alaska. So sometimes the numbers can be a little bit misleading, but in 2017, almost nothing burned in Alaska. So it's been quantified up to this point, but I think we're starting to see a shift in that as well. So thanks. Oh, were you next?
Sure, if you want it at the microphone.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
So right now, the state of Utah is in a process petitioning an exemption from the roadless rule and using wildfire as kind of the reason to petition kind of a new policy protecting, the roadless rule protects a lot of natural areas. And I was just wondering if you have any information or knowledge about roadless areas and what we should be doing to manage these areas. Should we be opening them up to more roads, temporary roads, logging, or are these landscapes generally more resilient than others because they have this lesser human interactions?
It's a complex question. In general, I would say historically, and this is not just in the U.S., but worldwide, when you see roads go in, you see more destruction of some kind, generally fire, because if people can get to it, they're lighting campfires and that sort of thing. But I would say, in talking about forest restoration, that we really have to look at each area individually, which is one of the reasons that it's going to be costly to do the type of science-based restoration that we need to do. But every place has its own unique ecological footprint. So it's not easy to say, you have to look at that particular roadless area.
Okay.
And with those questions in mind. So hopefully that answers your question, but it's like most things, it's a complicated situation.
Would it be fair to say that the roadless areas aren't solely the problem with catastrophic wildfire or mega fires, or is it a number of factors like that WUI as well, where we're allowing development? I mean, I guess I'm trying to figure out if they say the treatment is to open up roadless areas. Is it much larger than that? That's kind of what I'm thinking. Is it it's more of a broader question of how do we live with wildfire and how do we mitigate the impacts across the board, not just targeting one prescriptive designation.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. If I understand your point. But again, I would hedge and say it's complex. It's these values at risk that I talk about are so important that within reason, I think you have to throw everything that you can at it. But of course, the pocketbook or the checkbook is now bottomless. So if you look at Boulder, for instance, and the amount of national forests that we're surrounded by, it makes the most sense to begin treating, whether that means by culling small diameter trees and introducing prescribed burns into an area closest to where their houses. That is probably a good place to start. If we're looking at wilderness areas or places that are a little further out than population centers, then we have to look at what the values are at risk. A lot of 40% of people in this country get their drinking water from national forests, and watersheds are becoming increasingly problematic with the scale of fires that we're now seeing. So it really depends on where it is. It's kind of a frustratingly all and nothing approach, depending on where you are. But it's a really important question.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Hi. So I was a wildland firefighter for 5 seasons, and I was just a grunt, not involved in policy decisions, but I did learn a few things, and it seems to me that pretty much everyone is in agreement that we need to have more prescribed burns and more wildfire use fires, so just let more fires burn. Yeah. But that's also a very difficult decision and potentially a risky decision for forest superintendents or other land managers to make. For example, if there's a catastrophic fire in Redding, but it's a natural start, and it burns down 1,000 homes, we say, well, that's climate change, that's, our long-term fire policy catching up to us, but we can't really point fingers at any one particular person. But if we set a prescribed burn and it gets out of control and burns down a couple homes, then heads roll. We want accountability for that. And it seems that as we get more and more homes in the wildland-urban interface, and as long-term drought conditions get worse, and we sit around waiting for perfect conditions in which to do these prescribed burns so that we can do them in a controlled manner, it just doesn't get done. So I guess my question is, what do you see? Do you see anything being done to successfully promote prescribed burns in terms of protecting these decision makers from consequences or public education, or what do you think needs to be done to get more prescribed fires burning?
Yeah, thank you. Really good question. We saw the impact of that in Colorado in 2006. We were really cooking along in terms of prescribed fires. People were understanding the importance of them, especially close to homes. They were saying, please come cut more, please cut more, please come and burn more, until there was an escaped prescribed burn that killed 2 people. And again, unacceptable. But that lingers for a long time in public consciousness. And it's taken them the better part of a decade to begin to regain momentum in terms of regaining public trust. I think one of the most interesting things about fire policy that I learned in the book is that there's actually a wide purview, particularly on the federal level, to let fires burn, but they are both publicly and politically very unpopular. So that tends to influence, and personal culpability tend to influence decision-making more. But we're seeing now some pretty innovative efforts, particularly in national forests in California, where they're looking at the entire national forest and they're saying, okay, if a fire pops here, these are the resources at risk. They do this on a local level, like in Boulder too. But in terms of a larger landscape, which is really what we need to start looking at next, they say if a fire pops here, these are the values at risk. This is what we need to do. This is where you can let it burn if it's doing this and this and this, or this is where we've got to jump on it. So there's an effort to become a lot more targeted and tactical about that, and a lot, I think there's always been an effort to engage the public. Particularly, I saw in conversations with like the head of fire and aviation in Yosemite, who I talk about in the book, and she will go to neighboring communities and say, this is what we want to do, and this is why we're doing it, and these are all the efforts that we'll be making so that nothing goes wrong. And they're like, okay, until the match drops and, people freak out. So again, we have values at risk, so I understand that. But again, you'll look at a fire in the beginning of 2017, for instance, in Boulder, in an area where they've been trying to treat it, couldn't, burned until it reached an area where they did treat it, and the weather also cooperated. They were able to get at it. So that is very visible in the public perception of, okay, this is what happens when you do treat an area. And it was true in the Cold Springs fire above Boulder as well, that I showed that house with the area around it. If you treat your home ignition zone, if you treat public areas near the city like this, sometimes they just need to see what happens when you do and when you don't. So that's a very long answer to your question, but hopefully that helps.
Good, thanks.
I'd like to hear more about your experiences. Thank you.
I also was a wildland firefighter for 6 years, and 5 of those out of Rocky Mountain National Park, so just up the road from Boulder. But my question is, you mentioned needing to thin forests, and that's certainly a popular theme to a lot of wildland fire education. But talking to fire ecologists and reading about fire ecology and fuel types such as lodgepole forest and high elevation mixed conifer. So those forests are always high density. They're naturally high density forests, and you can't really go in and thin lodgepole to a safe level, because then all the trees just fall down because they don't have the support of the other trees. And so what you hear fire ecologists talk about, or what I've heard them talk about, is mosaic, where you have more frequent fire on the landscape and you maintain more area as meadow. You maybe change some acres from forest into meadow and into grassland. But that's kind of a harder sell to people, to tell them, hey, we're not just going to go thin the forest. We're actually going to get rid of it in some places, and try and make a grassland instead. I'm curious if you address that in your book at all, or if you've run across people who are trying to educate the public about that concept.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I get kind of painfully, to my editor's chagrin, specific about that in the book, because it really, I don't think I used the word mosaic in the talk just now, but maybe the word patchwork, and that is ultimately what we want to achieve in terms of diversity on the landscape. And that is an understanding that I think slowly but surely is coming into the public understanding. I think when people understand, whether it's public land or private land, I talk about a home inspection. There's a group called Wildfire Partners in Boulder that goes around to people's houses and says, this is what's going to work or not work if an ember shower comes through. And they'll tag different trees and they'll say, this has got to go, this has got to go. And I think what people realize, both in the private and the public sphere, is that they're tagging the small diameter trees, they're tagging the non-indigenous flora, they're tagging things that when they got rid of, the homeowners are like, oh wow, that just is better. We're not talking old growth, or we're not talking large diameter trees in those low elevation forests. Again, like you said, higher elevation lodgepole pine is very different from low elevation pondo pine forests. But those areas that need to be restored are pretty much the areas that we live in, right? Not a whole lot of us live in the lodgepole pine elevations. So yes, there's resistance to the idea still, but I think slowly but surely that understanding of that ecology is important, and the understanding that those landscapes that we fall in love with and want to maintain, that they're not going to change that dramatically if we do this type of restoration. And if we don't, they might really change dramatically, so much so that we may not be able to live where we're living, either because of a fire or because of the second phase of fires, of flooding and that kind of thing. So hopefully that answers your question. Sure. Yeah, how are we doing for time? Jan, okay?
Maybe 2 more questions.
Okay. Please don't worry if you have to get up and go. I'm not offended. Hi.
Hello. Thanks for coming here today. Just want to mention one name, Wade Parker, former student of mine, who did not survive the fire of Arizona a few years ago. But my question is basically, are you anticipating a change in the logging policy within the Forest Service? We used to log several billion with a B board foot of lumber every year. Now it's down to several million, which of course leads to the prevalence of overgrowth and contributes to the mega fires.
Yeah, thank you. I would say in general, the scale of restoration really needs to broaden greatly. I think the challenge with logging, again, it depends on a case-by-case basis, but the challenge that forest ecologists tell me about is that many forest or many loggers want to take the most valuable trees, which are often the larger diameter, older trees. And from an ecological restoration purpose, that's not particularly helpful in terms of a fire. It may be in some areas that are extremely dense, but it really depends on where it is. Where we need to do most of the work, particularly near population centers, is small diameter trees and is underbrush, clearing all of that and leaving a lot more of those larger diameter trees to create that diversity in the forest canopy. Because once you get rid of those co-opters, then the sunlight and the watersheds, they change, and there's more diversity on the landscape. So hopefully does that answer your question?
I understand, yes.
Okay.
thanks.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
Last question.
Yeah.
On July 5, 2017, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences identified that Earth is in the midst already of its 6th mass extinction episode, and that the next several decades are going to be interesting. Dar Jamail just recently published, he's a science writer, an award-winning science writer, recently published an article identifying the very real possibility of runaway climate change. And the New York Times identified several months ago that the time for doing anything about it was 30 years ago, and it's too late now. I have no hope. Do you?
Put me on the spot, why don't you? I do, at the moment, ask me tomorrow, I might feel differently, but I think I was in more of a hopeless state of mind until I worked on this book. And perhaps if you get a chance to read it, you'll understand why, because we know exactly what needs to be done. I didn't talk about what needs to be done in terms of climate change so much in this presentation. I talked more about kind of the practical applications of forest restoration. But the underlying point, of course, is if human-caused burning or human-caused warming has caused the number of acreage in the West to double over the past 30 years, the message is that we need to do something about the level of carbon in the atmosphere. So if we're not able to, we still know what needs to be done. But I think, yes, that's the underlying message generally. But I appreciate your point.
I was married to a smoke jumper and a hot shot.
Wow. I bet he had a lot of stories.
My father devised the aerial tanker system in California in the 1960s.
Wow.
So I know about fires.
Have you ever been to the smoke jumper base in Missoula?
I've been to the smoke jump. Yeah, I've been there, and I've been to the one in McCall.
That's a fascinating place if you're ever in Missoula. I talk about it in the book, but they have these huge rooms where they sew all their own parachutes and sew all their own gear, because if you ultimately make it to the ground and aren't flat, you only have yourself to thank for making all your own gear. But somebody trains them how to do that, of course, but amazing innovation in science and fire. But thank you so much for your question and your point.
More time?
Go ahead, last one.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask, what have you learned about beetle kill, increased beetle kill, and how that might affect fire?
Yeah, I do talk about that in the book as well. Thank you for bringing that up. That is also not an easy question to answer. The broad strokes are that it depends on what stage the forest is in terms of the beetle kill. Have the needles dried out completely? Have the branches fallen off? Have the trees fallen over? If you talk to fire behavior analysts, they'll say when they look at a cured, so to speak, beetle kill forest, they respond differently to relative humidity levels, so fire behavior will change. They might expect generally in a fire that humidity levels go down and fire behavior is tempered in the evening in particular. But when you're dealing with a lot of beetle kill, they'll see often that is not true, that it either doesn't change at all or there's actually an inverse. So it depends a lot on what stage the beetle kill is in. I think regardless, it's, from what I hear, a very dangerous place to try to fight fire, because the snag, as they call when the trees fall over, those hazards are extreme in that environment. So, yeah.
My understanding, I did fight fire as well. It's very increased, prone to fire and explosive fire. goes through, but what I'm wondering mostly is 20, 30 years down the line, is that going to build mosaic? Uintas, you just have holes. I can hardly hear him.
Oh, sorry, yeah, no microphone.
I didn't even hear the first question.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
The first question.
I was asking about beetle kills, or you go ahead.
Yeah, no, please.
And how that affects fire ecology. So I'm wondering, say 20, 30 years longer, 50 years down the road, you have these huge forests that are dead from beetle kill. We have huge areas in, well, of course, Colorado, and then in the Uintas, you see entire forests that are dead. I wonder what that's going to do down the line. Will that create a patchwork? I don't know.
You mean if it ultimately burns? Will that
Well,
create a patchwork?
I know that it's reduced burn probability. There aren't the needles to burn until you have that undergrowth, again, dense conifers and things to carry the fire. But I just wondered if you'd run across that with foresters, fire ecologists, what they're predicting way down the line, decades down.
Yeah, again, I think it depends on where it is. Even 50 years down the line, you know, even dead stuff retains moisture. So where and when it happens. If it's in a particularly drought-stricken place, then if the fire might burn with such intensity that nothing will grow, which we see more and more nowadays than we used to. But it also may, if all the trees have fallen down, it may be reduced to a ground fire, which is much more fightable, as you know, than a crown fire when the fire moves from one treetop to the other. So, difficult question to answer. But I don't think ultimately I don't think it means anything good. Kind of the bottom line, but I think there are misconceptions about beetle kill, forest, and fire in the same way there are misconceptions about fuel treatments in low or in higher elevation forests. You know, it's very popular to paint broad strokes, and sometimes with huge complex issues like fire, we want to do that. We want to say, okay, look at this patch. What needs to happen here is what needs to happen everywhere. And what's painfully clear now is that every place or a lot of places are unique. And that's why people need to be engaged and interested in their particular patches of earth, whether it's your home or your park, and you're engaged on that level because you know best what's happening here.
I think it's a really interesting question to wonder what the effects of pine beetles and fire in the future will be, because they're both, from what I've read, increasing due to climate change. Beetles having more reproduction cycles with a longer growing season, less severe winters.
Right.
And I think it's interesting to think what's going to happen like 100 years from now. I don't know.
Fortunately and unfortunately, neither of us will be here to see it, or none of us will be here to see it. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Heather Hansen, and then please stop by King's English on your way out.
Again. Anybody else has any other questions?